Today we'll take a look at Kadish. And this presentation will come in two parts. In the first, I'll summarize what we know about him, what Isha and the DRC tell us. And the second part will be a speculative analysis of his ages and what they show us about him rather than tell. This part will take place in the Kadish Gallery in the Canyon Mall. Just so you know, this entire presentation will be a massive story spoiler. So, if you haven't finished the hand towel and the shell parts of Euro, please consider yourself warned. There will be very minor puzzle spoilers for Ahnone and Kadish Talisa, one each. Very, very minor spoilers. I hope the sound is okay. Well, I suppose you would have already told me if it wasn't. So why Kadish? We never see him, we never interact with him, and no, trying to play ball with his skull does not count. We don't even really know what he looked like, but he certainly can be called one of the central characters of Owly. He's essentially a ghost in a narrative. If you want to read the one thing written with his own hands, you have to learn Dani, or look up a translation. And even that translation has question marks beside about 1/3 of the words because their meaning isn't verified, and only there because of context clues. Everything else comes from third parties, the DRC and Yisha. And fan theories abound. He's dead, he's alive, he was Evil Book who killed Yisha's mentor Kalam. Ask me about that one later if you like. But the truth is, we just don't know, because there's very little about him that can be called canon fact. Just lots of lore supplied by what are possibly unreliable narrators. His end is just as mysterious as his life. And should he still be around, nabbed from his own timeline by Yisha, it would make him the last surviving Dani master of the art. The fall of Dani occurred about 300 years ago, which is the average lifespan of a Dani. So even if a master survived the fall somewhere and somehow made it to relation, they're dead now. So, who was Kadish? And who might he have been? Before we get into things, I'd like to throw a few definitions at you that are relevant to this presentation and should facilitate the nerd out afterwards. The usual Doylist, Watsonian stuff applies. Doylist means to look at something from an out-of-universe point of view. That's what we're doing here in Kirel. Watsonian, on the other hand, means an inner-universe perspective. That will happen in the Kadish Gallery. Example, the death of Keta. The Doylist point of view would be she's a throwaway character who is only in the narrative to give birth to Atris. The Watsonian explanation, on the other hand, is that she dies because she's very ill and Anna can't save her. And these two perspectives must always be kept separate. To try and refute Keta is a fridge character with, but she was very ill, isn't a valid statement, because the agency of the author always trumps the agency of the character, because the author is in complete control of the narrative, and every story beat represents a conscious choice. The next term I'd like to talk about is lore. Lore is what you learn about the game world within the game. There's also meta lore, and example for that would be that the song playing in the gallery was performed by Kadish's wife, who then died alone. But we only know that because the composer said that this is what he was imagining when he wrote the track. but there is nothing in the game or in the official materials that suggests that Kadish even was married. So those are tidbits mentioned by creators outside the context of the game. For example, in interviews or Q&As and the like. For this presentation, I chose not to acknowledge any meta lore or anything that isn't in any of sorry, or that isn't in any of the official releases. So we'll have the games, the novels, and the official DRC website. Next one is canon. Canon, that's the established facts about the in-game universe, the stuff that's set in stone. Not to be confused with lore. Lore can be factually wrong, especially if the unreliable narrator trope is in play and things you find or what characters tell you can be false. Either because they're mistaken or operating with limited knowledge, or because they're outright lying. For example, you can't link to an age from within the age. That's a piece of lore. The Denis sincerely believed that, but it was proven wrong. You can do it anytime you want, in your own Relto. Another piece of lore is the whole borrow thing. Like, we're told they were enslaved, we're told they were freed, but if and how it all happened, that's still highly controversial. And I think that's deliberate. So at least some of what we've got here is lore, not necessarily canon. The next term is interpretation. An interpretation is when you look at a piece of lore and start to form your own thoughts about the game world or narrative based on that. Interpretations may vary widely, but what they all have in common is that they must be based on in-game evidence, or meta-lore at the very least. They can only be refuted by canon evidence, not by other lore, and therefore you can absolutely disagree with a read while still accepting it as valid. Headcanon, on the other hand, is something you personally believe about a fictional world or a character that is not based on either canon or lore and just mirrors your own preferences. For example, Yisha has a cat. There is no evidence for that anywhere. It's just an idea that I like. And you may say, I think she's more of a dog person actually. But neither of our headcanons is more valid than the other, and we never have the right to impose that on other people. Similarly to the Doylist and Watsonian stuff above, interpretations and headcanons should not be mixed. Okay, all clarity dispelled? Yes, everyone sufficiently confused? Let's get to Kadish. So, what do we know about Guildmaster Kadish? We don't really know when exactly he was born or anything about his family, but I think since he entered the Guild of Writers, that it must have been a prominent one. As per Book of Tiana, the common practice was to give boys to a guild at age 4. So basically your family decides on the course your life takes, and there was zero self-determination. It also meant that the membership with the great guilds was kept within a few upper-class families. Kadish eventually attained the rank of master, but never rose above mediocrity, either because his true passion and talent lay with engineering, or because he was a bit of a rebel. We'll get to that. After some kind of incident, he was kicked out of the guild and opened a gallery where he sold art to the upper class. That was so successful that he ended up being one of the wealthiest people in Denis, and he later bought the Watcher's pub and refurbished it to his specifications. And this is when he starts his grower project and chose specific parts of the prophecy to emulate. A grower to move through time, a grower to banish the darkness, and a grower to follow the shell. His claims got a lot of attention among the ruling class especially, but his plans were cut short by the fall of Denis. He fled to his vault age, Kadish to Lisa, where he died alone, leaving a note that he died surrounded with what was most precious to him, mentioning books. Plural. We'll get to that later too. And that is the bare bones of what we learn about him in the game. But wouldn't it be more fun to dig into other things and speculate from there? Well, I certainly think so, and I hope so do you, so let's do that. Let's do some art analysis. Let's totally overthink things. And now we'll be moving to the Kadish gallery. So the speculative part of my presentation is divided into the ages he wrote and the places he influenced. We'll look at each one and we'll see what their design can tell us about what kind of person he was. This, as I said before, is an entirely Watsonian endeavor, meaning the analysis will be entirely from an in-universe perspective, and it's not meant to be taken entirely seriously. This is just me sharing my brain weasels. Alright, the first stage I'd like to talk about is Ahnone. Let's do the time warp again. Kadish was not only a brilliant writer, we'll get to that in a minute, I'll tell you why I don't think he was mediocre, but also an excellent engineer, and it really shows in the age of Ahnone. As you all know, it's comprised of 4 spherical builds that rotate in, so it gives you the illusion of time travel. There, that's the spoiler. There's 4 spheres, not 3. The 4th sphere is still under construction, and I gotta say, I keep wondering who exactly did all of the building. Surely that kind of work can't be done by one man alone. Who were his helpers? I think we can rule out the borrow. Kadish was no longer a member of the Great Guild, and had no access to the golden tablet used to control them, if he ever even knew about the tablet in the first place. Kalam sure didn't, and he was of the same rank. So, who else was in on it? Who would he trust with that kind of secret? It's impossible to keep a secret like this forever, and no matter how many NDAs you make people sign. So perhaps, and this is just my theory, mind you, he never meant for it to remain a secret for long. As impressive as the construction is, it seems a bit ramshackle, especially if you compare the elaborate, sturdy design of the machine to the flimsy theatre backdrops inside the spheres themselves. To me, this smells like a short-term deception, not a long-term one. Besides the design, who would believe that this was actually Gardernay? Where is the evidence that the Rhone ever lived here? The statue in the unfinished portion of the machine tells us that Kadish certainly had a high opinion of himself. You don't make humongous statues of your own person if you don't have a certain amount of arrogance. It's also the first thing that he finished, before anything else. The statue is the only thing in that sphere that's actually complete. So it follows that it's the most important thing to him here. The statue also tells us that he probably wasn't all that old. Apparently, aging Denis liked to wear beards, and the statue doesn't have it, and there's no signs of age in the statue's face. So my personal guess is that he was born about 100 to 150 years before the fall. Last piece of evidence that speaks for the Denis version of Punkt. Ahnone is a Taurus age. The only other writer that we know of who ever pulled off a functional one was Katran. This certainly reads like a how many fudge yous can I squeeze into one age to me. So, what led him to do this? Where does this obvious contempt for the Denis way of doing things come from? Age Arcana. Rage Against the Machine. Arcana is a food age Kadish probably wrote for the Guild of Caterers and repurposed. It shows us what his work life would have been like. Your basic, unfulfilling mid-management desk job, writing boring ages for resources. No wonder he wasn't content. He was stuck creating products to specification, not, well, art. Where Ahnone is wild and imaginative, Arcana is dry in every sense, and utilitarian. But there is a stark beauty in the landscape and hidden pockets of lovely plant life. Thank you, MOULa, for letting me take those home. I love them. In contrast, the machine is just plain ugly. There is no love in the design, only function. I can't help but think it's an unconscious depiction of his own life as a guild writer. Churn out what is needed, don't question, don't think. The machine is alien in the canyons of Arcana, a depiction of Kadish's own alienation from his work. You gotta remember that he was probably still pretty young as Denis went. He was in the equivalent of his 30s or 40s when he died. So what we've got here is the equivalent of a 20 or 30 something who is bored and frustrated having to listen to old farts telling him what to do. No matter how good you were, the Denis didn't listen to people who hadn't reached the 200-year mark yet. That's when you were seen as a proper mature adult. So if you were a young progressive, you were out of luck. Atreus the Elder had the same problem in the Book of Tiana. I don't think Kadish had it in him to create something completely devoid of beauty. He obviously had strong aesthetic sensibilities. Why else create and run a place like the Gallery? But if you walk through Arcana, you can just about see him chafe. Compare it to the lush environment of Tolesa and you can see where his heart truly lies. Kadish Tolesa. Happy little trees. It's my favorite age in all of Uru, and not just because I like deep purple. I think Tolesa is who he is. It might just be the age truest to his nature. It wasn't written with other people, visitors in mind. It was a place that was only for him. It's markedly different from other Denis ages and reminds me a lot more of Katran's and Anna's playful surrealism. Aside from him writing Ahnone as a Taurus age, just for shits and giggles, the design of Tolesa is the strongest evidence for Kadish being a rebel. It breaks with so many conventions. Denis ages overall come in two varieties: practical, like Teledan, Garrison and Arcana, and pretty, like the various Garden ages. But none of them are so delightfully creative and whimsical as Katran's or Anna's ages, or indeed, as Kadish Tolesa. The surreal feel of Katran's and Anna's work can be explained by them having to experiment, since they learned the intricacies of the art after the fall of Denis, when most of the knowledge was already lost. Kadish had a master rank in the Guild of Writers, which generally means you're a member qualified to teach. But he was nowhere near the leadership. He didn't need to experiment and learn through trial and error. He knew all the rules, all the techniques, and he chose to break them. Kadish Tolesa shows us what he secretly yearned for: beauty, creativity, individuality. Tolesa is his, and it's a reflection of his inner being, his wants and desires that he had to hide in a society that would never accept them. He hid in plain sight, first as a guildmaster churning out ages for his society to exploit, and later as a gallery owner selling art to the wealthy. He hid all the clues in plain sight too, maybe because he was bored and frustrated, Or maybe because he was enamored with his own cleverness. Maybe both. But it's clear he chafed against the rigidity of Denis society. On the outside, he was a successful businessman, absolutely raking it in. But on the inside? If you look at the contents of the vault, you'll see piles of gold and precious objects strewn about willy-nilly. It's careless. But the thing is, he was not a careless person, and that shows in his ages. His society told him that he was supposed to care about riches, advancement, but he got himself booted from the Guild of Writers, and he piled his riches in his vault like so much garbage that he didn't know what to do with. Someone who cared about wealth would have his riches organized, lovingly displayed, the coins collected in little bags for easy counting, for example. This is a guy just going through the motions. It was only a matter of time until he cracked. And now we come to this place, the Kadish Gallery. The gallery is what he created as a livelihood after he was kicked out of the guild. Boys gotta eat, after all, and this shows us his greatest strength as a person, his ability to adapt. He took what he had learned about aesthetics during his schooling and applied that knowledge in an entirely new way. And he now, he was his own boss, and nobody got to tell him what to do anymore. And his business absolutely flourished. Here's another point in favor of the Kadish wasn't a greedy asshole theory. After he made an absolute fortune with his gallery, eventually he turned it into a museum with the puzzle solution to his Vault Age on display. Someone who values their richities doesn't do that kind of thing. Can you imagine Bill Gates putting all of his money, or a big part of it, in a puzzle vault, leaving clues in a public location and be like, hey, if you're clever enough to break in, you deserve to have what's in there? I think he didn't want riches for the sake of having them. He wanted respect, acceptance. He wanted to be appreciated for his abilities, not for selling pretty things to the rich. Well, he wasn't really getting that with the Denis. So what do you do with a society that you don't fit into? Well, you've got two options. Withdraw and cut yourself off, or become an enfant terrible. You start shaking things up for the sake of shaking things up. Igura, the Watcher's Pub, expert level trolling. Another lovely location, another machine that we don't really know where it came from, who built it, who helped him build it, who locked all the materials there, we don't know. This is the hub of Hoodwink, the stage for his biggest audacity. We will never know why he felt like he needed to scam his entire civilization. Was he delusional, arrogant, power-hungry, or did he intend for people to cotton onto his bullshit eventually? I don't think he truly believed himself to be the grower. I don't think he believed in much of anything. And I don't think he lusted for power either, or he would have just stuck with the Guild of Writers. Or he would have used his wealth to directly assert influence, which he didn't. He could have gone down a very dark path and allied himself with radical reactionaries like Aegeris and Viovis. He didn't. He never sought to destroy Denis. I think he meant to show his people a mirror so they could take a long, hard look at their own foolishness. I see the whole scheme as a big fat screw you directed at the guild that refused to see the potential in experimentation and creativity, the wealthy who think themselves above the rest of society, and a society that has calcified and refuses to progress in any meaningful way. Yisha constructs a neat narrative around his bones, but I think there's more to him than a wannabe grower and hoarder of wealth. And I think she saw that too, The alternative vault speaks for itself. There must have been something worth saving. The possible solution to this enigma is in his last letter. He says he is dying, surrounded by all that he loves, and he mentions books. I'll be the first to admit that my Denis is rudimentary at best, but I found a source that has both a translation and a transliteration, and I looked at it, and it is indeed a plural. If you like, I'll share the link to that transcription later on. And it's signed Guildmaster Kadish, even though he was kicked out of that guild. So yeah, dude had a bit of an ego indeed. And this shows us that he probably was still sore about that. But the only book you find in the vault links back to the gallery, and it's stamped with the DRC logo, so it's probably not the original book that was there for Yisha to find when she came to this place way before the DRC ever did. When Ageris and Viovis set the plague loose in the cavern, they also linked dying people into populated ages stored in the Great Library. It is very possible that Kadish watched them do this, grabbed what books he could, and linked to Talisa with them. The Denis had rolled out the key system shortly before the fall, so he was probably able to warn the people in those ages not to link back in the cavern under any circumstances. But since he came from the cavern, he had no way of knowing if he was infected or not, so he dared not leave the vault. And that might be what Yisha saw, and that might be why she cared to save him. So where is he now? Personally, I like the idea of him still being around. There are so many interesting things that you can do with a story about an actual Denis survivor, someone like Kadish who likes to have the last laugh. Someday I hope we'll get to find out, because it definitely looks like the end of his story has not yet been written. And this is it, folks. This is how you do environmental storytelling. The ages themselves have a voice. Not everything worth knowing or understanding was written down in journals for you to read. So, thank you for listening. Thank you, Nozila, for kicking my butt. Thank you, Minasunda and Nozila both, for organizing and general hand-holding. I appreciate your help and patience very much. And thank you, Andre, for helping me fix the stream.